Hi, welcome back to Spirit TV. We're going to spend this short segment on how we facilitate the concept of circular learning. And it's important to note as background that circular learning and linear learning both have a part in the learning methodology of the Spirit of Caregiving. But we want to introduce this concept here so we give people some background that we can refer back to later. Because we really will refer back to this as we grow. As Spirit continues over the next 2 days, it can get uncomfortable for people, and we're going to ask people to push through. And that is entirely the concept of circular learning. But let me kind of overview with you how we introduce this concept. To set the stage, it's beginning of day 1. We're on the very first slide that talks about what to expect, the second bullet. We're going to spend some time over the next 2 days talking about how we learn. Some things we do will be very didactic, and didactic learning is where there's one person speaking and there's one person listening. We're also going to spend some time on traditional or linear learning and non-traditional or circular learning. Believe it or not, you're already very familiar with these two concepts. When you learned arithmetic, what is the very first thing you learned? And this now becomes an interaction back and forth with the group. Right, you learn numbers first, and then addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. And it's interesting when you learned math, because we all learned it the same way, and I'm sure we all went to very different schools, and probably some people in this room went to school outside the country, and we still learned it in a very linear fashion. Linear basically is you learn one thing, and then you learn something else and something else. They all build upon each other. So let's switch that around a little bit, and let's talk about something that's more circular in nature. For those of you who did, I bet you most of you did, when you learned to ride a bike, when you learned to ride a bicycle, what's the first thing you did? How'd you learn? And this also is an interaction with the group. That's right, you learned to pedal, you learned to balance, you learned to steer, right? So which did you do first? That's right, you had to do them all at the same time, because you can't really balance without steering, without pedaling. You can't do that. You have to do it all at the same time. That's circular learning. But let me make two very clear distinctions for you. When we learn something in a linear fashion, like math, we tend to forget. And we learn something in a circular fashion, we tend to remember. If I brought the last math test that you took in school, if I brought that back for you today, how many of you would ace it with 100%? I'm sure some of you would. I'm sure some of you would. I wouldn't. Because when we learn something in that linear fashion, we tend to forget what we've learned. Now, if I brought a bicycle back here today and brought it out front, how many of you would be able to get on that bike and ride, even if you haven't ridden for many years? I bet you a lot of you could. It's where that saying came from. It's like riding a bike. When we learn something in circular fashion, we tend to remember. Second distinction I want to tell you about. When we learn something with linear learning, we tend to stop when the going gets tough. So, what's the last math class you guys took? Do you remember? And why did you stop? Why did you not continue? You'll get responses like, it was too hard, I didn't need it for my major, I just was doing terrible. But that's right. Sometimes, nothing is all the time, but sometimes when we learn things in a linear fashion, when things get rough, when the going gets tough, we stop. Now let's switch gears back to circular learning for that same distinction. With circular learning, we tend to push through when the going gets tough. Do you remember when you learned to ride a bike? And you're riding your bike and your mom or your dad or your big brother was holding the back seat and they're pushing you along, and they said they would never let go. And what did they do? They let go. And what did you do? Remember? You fell. And then what happened? For most of us, after we dusted ourselves off and maybe shed a few tears, we got back on the bike and tried again. Maybe it had to wait till the next day, but we got back on that bike and we rode it again. That's because circular learning. When we learn something in that circular fashion, when things start to get tough, we push through. So those two distinctions. But let me give you a personal example. When I think about linear learning and circular learning, it always comes to my mind about when our boys were in high school and they learned Spanish. They both had 2 years of Spanish in high school, and they learned it in a very linear fashion. My house is gray, my hair is brown, my name is Ryan. First one thing and then another. Ryan had a classmate who kind of skipped the 2 years in high school, but she did an exchange program in Madrid, Spain for the summer. She was immersed in the language, and she really had to learn Spanish in a very circular fashion because it was all thrown at her at the same time. She had to do that to survive. So when our boys were learning Spanish, it got tough, so they quit. They didn't go past the 2 years that was required. Amanda, who was in Madrid, couldn't quit. She had to push through. So who do you think can learn Spanish today, still knows Spanish today? Yeah, Amanda does. She really remembers it mainly because of the way she learned it in a circular fashion. There's a place in learning for circular and linear learning, but here at Spirit, we're going to spend a lot of time in this circular learning method. And the reason I'm telling you that is sometimes when you learn something in a circular manner, think about learning to ride a bike or Amanda learning Spanish, it can be very uncomfortable and very tough. But we're going to ask you, just like riding a bike, we're going to ask you to push through when things seem uncomfortable. And actually, some people say, we want you to lean into the discomfort. We want you to appreciate the fact that it is uncomfortable. And I promise you that what you learn, parts of what you learn here in the Spirit of Caregiving over the next 2 days, you're going to remember for a very long time. That's really the end of it for that section, and you just go on to the next bullet. But I want you to practice in advance and maybe even outline it down. Bike, arithmetic, and a personal example. It's very important that you come up with a personal example to illustrate this. And the key point here are the two distinctions. That number one, with linear learning, we tend to forget. With circular learning, we tend to remember. And the second distinction is with linear learning, we tend to stop when the going gets tough. And with circular learning, we tend to push through. Thank you so much. And I want you to practice, outline it out, and let me know if you need any help.